The city streets were cold and unforgiving as Daniel Harper shuffled through the dimly lit alleyway. His tattered coat did little to shield him from the biting wind, and his stomach growled from the lack of food. He clutched his belongings, a worn-out backpack and a blanket, and made his way toward the park where he often found refuge. As he neared a bench tucked under a street lamp, he stopped in his tracks. A young woman sat there, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She cradled her stomach protectively, and even in the dim light, Daniel could see the fear etched on her face. "Are you okay, miss?" he asked cautiously, his deep voice raspy from years on the streets. The woman looked up, startled. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying. "I'm fine," she said quickly, but her trembling hands betrayed her words. Daniel hesitated. "You don't look fine. What's going on?" The woman hesitated, then let out a bitter laugh. "What's going on? I'm pregnant. My boyfriend doesn't want the baby. My parents kicked me out to protect their precious reputation. I have nowhere to go. That's what's going on." Daniel felt a pang of sympathy. He'd seen plenty of hardship in his time, but there was something about this young woman's despair that struck a chord. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Claire," she said, wiping her eyes. "Claire Monroe." "Well, Claire," Daniel said, sitting down on the bench beside her, "it sounds like you've had a rough go of it. But sitting here in the cold isn't going to help. What else am I supposed to do?" Claire snapped, her voice breaking. "I don't have anywhere to go. I don't even have money for food." Daniel thought for a moment. He didn't have much, but he knew what it felt like to be completely alone. "You can stay with me," he offered. Claire looked at him in disbelief. "Stay with you? You're homeless." "I am," Daniel admitted. "But I can protect you, and I know where to find food and shelter. It's not much, but it's better than this." Claire hesitated, her instincts warning her against trusting a stranger. But as she looked into Daniel's kind eyes, she saw no malice, only genuine concern. Finally, she nodded. "Okay," she said quietly. "Thank you." Over the next few days, Daniel and Claire developed an unlikely bond. He shared his meager resources with her, teaching her how to navigate the shelters and soup kitchens that had become his lifeline. Claire, in turn, found solace in his quiet strength. Despite his rough exterior, Daniel treated her with a gentleness she hadn't experienced in years. One evening, as they sat around a fire in a makeshift camp, Claire turned to Daniel. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. Daniel stared into the flames, his expression pensive. "Because no one helped me when I needed it," he said simply. "And because everyone deserves a second chance." Claire's eyes filled with tears. "I don't think I deserve one." "You do," Daniel said firmly. "And so does that baby. We'll figure this out together." For the first time in weeks, Claire felt a glimmer of hope. She didn't know what the future held, but for now, she wasn't alone. The days turned into weeks, and Daniel and Claire fell into a rhythm that revolved around survival. Their lives were far from easy, but they managed to carve out a sense of stability amidst the chaos. Daniel had a knack for finding resources, and with Claire by his side, he was more determined than ever to ensure they made it through each day. One morning, as they sat on the steps of an abandoned church, Daniel handed Claire a warm cup of soup he had managed to get from a local shelter. "Eat," he said. "You need to keep your strength up." Claire took the cup, her hands trembling slightly. "You keep saying that," she said, managing a faint smile. "You act like this baby is yours." Daniel shrugged, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe I don't have kids of my own," he said. "But someone needs to look out for you and that little one. Might as well be me." Claire stared at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. "You're the only person who's cared," she said softly. "My parents, my ex. They all turned their backs on me." Daniel's jaw tightened. That's their loss. People like that don't know what they're missing. As the months passed, Claire's belly grew, and with it, so did her determination. Daniel encouraged her to find small ways to prepare for the future, even when it felt impossible. They would sit together in the library, poring over parenting books and looking up local resources for single mothers. "You're going to be a great mom," Daniel said one afternoon as Claire read aloud from a dog-eared guide to newborn care. Claire laughed, though her voice wavered with emotion. "I wish I believed that." "You will," Daniel said. "You've already made it this far." But not everyone was as kind as Daniel. The stigma of homelessness followed Claire wherever she went. One particularly cold afternoon, as they stood in line at a soup kitchen, a woman behind them sneered. "Look at her," the woman muttered to her companion. "Pregnant and on the streets. What a disgrace." Claire's face burned with humiliation. She opened her mouth to respond, but Daniel gently touched her arm. "Don't," he said quietly. "They don't know you." Later that night, as they sat huddled by their small fire, Claire broke down. "How do you do it?" she asked, tears streaming down her face. "How do you ignore what people think of you?" Daniel looked at her, his eyes filled with quiet resolve. "You learn to focus on what matters," he said. "And what matters is you and that baby, not them." Claire nodded, though her heart still ached. Daniel's words were comforting, but the weight of her situation was a constant reminder of how far she had fallen. As her due date approached, Claire grew more anxious. "What happens when the baby comes?" she asked Daniel one evening. "We can barely take care of ourselves." Daniel didn't hesitate. "We'll figure it out," he said firmly. "I'll find work, or something. But I promise, I won't let you do this alone." Claire stared at him, her chest tightening. "Why do you care so much?" Daniel hesitated, then said, "Because you remind me of someone I lost. My sister. She was about your age when she passed. And I couldn't save her. But maybe I can help you." Claire reached out, placing a hand on his. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything." The bond between them grew stronger, but so did the challenges they faced. One evening, as they returned to their camp, they found their belongings scattered and their blankets stolen. Claire sank to the ground, her hands clutching her stomach as tears streamed down her face. "We can't live like this," she sobbed. "It's not safe." Daniel knelt beside her, his voice steady despite his own fear. "We'll find a way," he said. "I won't let anything happen to you." The next day, Daniel approached a local charity that offered temporary housing for homeless families. After pleading his case, they managed to secure a small room in a shelter. It wasn't much, but to Claire, it felt like a miracle. As she lay on the thin mattress that night, Daniel sitting nearby, she felt her baby kick for the first time. Her hand flew to her stomach, her eyes wide with wonder. "Daniel," she whispered. "The baby, he's moving." Daniel's face broke into a rare smile. "That's a fighter," he said. "Just like his mom." For the first time in months, Claire allowed herself to hope. With Daniel by her side, maybe, just maybe, they could make it through. The sound of Claire's labored breathing filled the small room at the shelter. The fluorescent light above flickered, casting long shadows on the worn walls. Daniel sat beside her, his hands gripping hers tightly as another contraction racked her body. "You're doing great, Claire," Daniel said, his voice steady but strained. "Just breathe." Claire looked at him through tears, her face pale and damp with sweat. "I can't do this," she gasped. "It hurts too much." "Yes, you can," Daniel said firmly. "You've come this far. You're stronger than you think." The shelter's volunteer nurse bustled into the room, her presence a calming force. "You're almost there," she said, glancing at the monitor. "Just a few more pushes." Claire shook her head, panic rising in her chest. "I'm scared," she whispered, her voice breaking. Daniel leaned closer, his eyes meeting hers. "I'm right here," he said. "You're not alone. You've got this." Minutes later, the cry of a newborn filled the room. Claire's sobs of pain turned to tears of relief as the nurse placed a tiny baby boy in her arms. She stared down at him, her heart swelling with a love she had never known. "Hi there," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm your mom." Daniel stood beside her, his face filled with awe. He reached out hesitantly, his rough hands trembling as he gently touched the baby's tiny fingers. "Perfect," Daniel said softly. Claire looked up at him, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "We did it," she said. "Thank you for staying with me." Daniel smiled, his voice quiet but full of emotion. "I wouldn't have been anywhere else." The weeks after the baby's birth were a blur of sleepless nights and tender moments. The shelter staff provided formula, diapers, and other essentials, but it was Daniel who became Claire's constant support. He helped feed the baby, rocked him to sleep, and even sang soft lullabies in his rough, low voice. One evening, as the baby dozed in Daniel's arms, Claire watched them from across the room. Her chest tightened at the sight of the man who had saved her life and the baby who had given her a reason to keep going. For the first time, she felt like she had a family. But life in the shelter was far from easy. The crowded conditions and the ever-present fear of what lay ahead weighed heavily on Claire. She knew she couldn't stay there forever. One morning, as she fed the baby, she turned to Daniel. "I need to go back to work," she said, her voice determined. "I need to build a future for him." Daniel frowned. "Are you sure you're ready? You've been through so much." Claire nodded, her jaw set. "I don't have a choice. He deserves more than this." Daniel hesitated, then said, "What about your parents? Have you thought about reaching out to them?" Claire's face darkened. "They made it clear I wasn't welcome. I can't go crawling back now." "Maybe they've changed," Daniel said gently. "People can surprise you." Claire shook her head. "I don't need their pity. I'll figure this out on my own." With Daniel's encouragement, Claire began applying for jobs. Her polished resume and impressive academic background quickly caught the attention of several employers. Within weeks, she secured a position at a local marketing firm. The pay wasn't much, but it was a start. On her first day back at work, Claire was a bundle of nerves. As she stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her blazer, Daniel approached with the baby in his arms. "You're going to be amazing," he said. Claire smiled, her eyes misting. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Daniel grinned. "Lucky for you, you don't have to find out." Claire threw herself into her new job, determined to prove herself. Her talent and drive quickly caught the attention of her supervisors, and within months, she earned a promotion. With each step forward, her confidence grew, and she began to see a future she had never thought possible. But the more successful she became, the more the gap between her and Daniel seemed to widen. While Claire spent her days in boardrooms and client meetings, Daniel remained at the shelter, caring for the baby and living a life far removed from hers. One evening, as Claire returned from work, she found Daniel sitting on the floor of the small room, playing with the baby. His face lit up when he saw her, but there was a hint of something else, an uncertainty she couldn't ignore. "Hey," she said, sitting beside him. "How was your day?" Daniel shrugged. "Same as always," he said. "Yours?" Claire hesitated, then said, "Busy. But good." There was a silence between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Daniel looked at her and said, "Claire, you don't need me anymore." Claire's heart sank. "What are you talking about?" "You're doing great," Daniel said. "You've built this amazing life for you and your son. I don't have anything to offer you anymore." Claire grabbed his hand, her voice firm. "That's not true. You've given us everything. And I'm not letting you go." Claire's words lingered in the room, but Daniel looked away, his expression a mix of gratitude and doubt. "You don't need me holding you back, Claire," he said, his voice low. "You're on your way to a better life, and I'm just a guy who's lived on the streets." "You're not just a guy," Claire replied, her tone fierce. "You saved me, Daniel. When no one else cared, you stood by me. You're the reason I'm here. Daniel shook his head, his hands tightening into fists. I didn't do anything special. You're the one who made it this far. You and your son deserve more than what I can give you. Claire's voice softened as she leaned closer, her eyes searching his. You've given us love, Daniel. That's more than anyone else ever did. Don't you see? You're part of this family now. The tension between them lingered in the days that followed. While Claire threw herself into her work, Daniel spent more time alone, reflecting on his place in her life. He couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong in her new world, a world of sharp suits, business meetings, and polished success. One afternoon, as he sat on a park bench with the baby bundled in his arms, a man approached. He was older, with graying hair and a suit that screamed wealth. Daniel recognized him instantly. Claire's father. So, you're the man who's been helping my daughter. Mr. Monroe said, his tone cold but measured. Daniel's jaw tightened. And you're the man who threw her out. Mr. Monroe flinched but quickly composed himself. I did what I thought was right at the time, he said. But I've come to realize I was wrong. I want her to come home. Daniel's chest tightened. It's not up to me. You'll have to talk to her. Mr. Monroe hesitated, then said, You care about her, don't you? Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down at the baby in his arms, his heart aching. Of course, I do, he said finally. Then let her go, Mr. Monroe said. She belongs in a world you can't give her. A world where she and my grandson will be taken care of. Daniel's hands clenched around the edge of the stroller. She doesn't need your money, he said. She's done fine without you. Maybe, Mr. Monroe said, his voice hardening. But don't you think she deserves more than this? That evening, Daniel couldn't shake the man's words. When Claire returned home from work, her face lit up as she scooped her son into her arms. She looked radiant, confident, and completely at ease in her new life. And in that moment, Daniel felt like an outsider in the world she was building. After dinner, as Claire rocked the baby to sleep, Daniel sat across from her, his expression heavy with conflict. Your father came to see me today, he said quietly. Claire froze, her eyes narrowing. What did he want? He wants you to go home, Daniel said. He wants to make things right. Claire shook her head, her jaw tightening. He doesn't get to decide that. He gave up that right when he threw me out. Daniel hesitated, then said, he might be right, Claire. You've worked so hard to rebuild your life. Maybe it's time to leave the past behind. Claire's eyes filled with tears as she looked at him. What are you saying, Daniel? Are you trying to push me away? I just don't want to hold you back, Daniel said, his voice breaking. You and your son deserve the best, and I'm not sure I can give you that. Claire stood, her emotions boiling over. You don't get to decide what's best for us, Daniel. You've been there for me when no one else was. You're part of this family, whether you believe it or not. Daniel looked away, his heart heavy. I just want you to be happy. Claire stepped closer, her voice trembling with emotion. Then stay. Stay and fight for us. Their conversation left both of them raw and uncertain. Over the next few days, Claire focused on her work while Daniel kept his distance, unsure of what to do. The baby's laughter and Claire's determination reminded him of the life they had built together, but the fear of not being enough loomed large. One evening, as Claire returned home from work, she found Daniel packing a small bag. Her heart dropped. What are you doing? She asked, her voice sharp. I think it's time I go, Daniel said, his back to her. You've got a good life now, Claire. You don't need me anymore. Claire marched over, grabbing his arm and spinning him around. Don't you dare, she said, her voice trembling with anger. You don't get to walk away just because you're scared. I'm not scared, Daniel said, though his voice betrayed him. I just don't want to hold you back. Claire's eyes filled with tears. You're not holding me back, Daniel. You're the reason I made it this far. And if you leave now, you'll be proving my father right, that you don't belong in my life. But you do. We need you. Daniel stared at her, his chest tight with emotion. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe her words, that he could be part of something greater than himself. Daniel's hands trembled as he set the bag down, Claire's words echoing in his mind. She stood before him, her eyes filled with both anger and love, daring him to stay, to fight for the family they had created together. I don't know how to do this, Claire, Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. I've spent my whole life barely getting by. What kind of future can I give you and your son? Claire stepped closer, her tone softening. The kind where you're here, Daniel. The kind where we figure it out together. I don't need you to be perfect, I just need you to be you. For the first time, Daniel allowed himself to believe her words. He nodded, his throat tight with emotion. I'll stay, he said. If you'll have me. Claire's face broke into a smile as she pulled him into a hug. We've always had you, she said. Now let's figure out the rest. Over the following weeks, Claire began to include Daniel in every aspect of her life, determined to show him that he was not just a temporary part of their journey. She encouraged him to pursue opportunities he had long thought were out of reach. You're smart, Daniel, she said one evening as they sat at the kitchen table. You just need to believe it. What about getting your GED? It's never too late. Daniel hesitated. I haven't been in school since I was a teenager, he said. What if I fail? Then we'll try again, Claire said, her voice unwavering. You taught me not to give up, remember? With Claire's support, Daniel enrolled in a GED program at a local community center. The first day was daunting, but as he sat in the classroom surrounded by others chasing second chances, he realized he wasn't alone. Slowly but surely, he began to find his footing. Claire was his biggest cheerleader, celebrating each small victory. When he passed his first practice test, she surprised him with a home-cooked dinner and a small cake that read, "You're amazing. You didn't have to do all this," Daniel said, his cheeks flushing as he sat down at the table. I wanted to, Claire said, her smile warm. You deserve to know how proud we are of you. Daniel glanced at the baby, who sat in his high chair babbling happily. Even him? Especially him, Claire said, laughing. As Daniel grew more confident in himself, he began to take on more responsibility at home. He found a part-time job at a local hardware store, where his knack for fixing things quickly made him a favorite among customers. For the first time in years, he felt like he had a purpose beyond survival. One evening, as they sat together after dinner, Daniel turned to Claire. I want to do more, he said. I've been thinking about taking some classes in construction or mechanics. Something where I can build a real career. Claire's eyes lit up. That's a wonderful idea, she said. You're great with your hands, and there's always work in those fields. Daniel hesitated. It'll take time, though. What if I'm still not enough? Claire placed a hand over his. You're already enough, she said firmly. This isn't about proving yourself to me or anyone else. It's about doing what makes you proud. One weekend, Claire invited Daniel to a company event, her first big celebration since her promotion. At first, Daniel resisted, worried about how he would be received in her world. But Claire wouldn't take no for an answer. You're part of this family, she said. And I want everyone to see that. At the event, Daniel felt out of place among the polished suits and sparkling dresses. But as he stood by Claire's side, holding the baby in his arms, he realized something important. He belonged because Claire believed in him. That night, as they drove home, Daniel turned to Claire. You've given me so much, he said. I don't know how to thank you. Claire smiled, reaching for his hand. You already have, she said. You gave me hope when I thought I'd lost everything. And you gave my son a father. Daniel looked at her, his chest swelling with emotion. You both gave me a reason to be better, he said. And I'll never stop trying. The years that followed were a testament to resilience and love. Daniel had completed his GED and enrolled in a vocational program, focusing on construction management. Though the journey was far from easy, he pushed through, driven by the belief that he could build a better future for his family. Claire stood by him every step of the way, her unwavering support becoming the foundation on which he rebuilt his life. Their son, Nathan, grew into a bright, curious toddler who adored Daniel. To Nathan, Daniel was more than a father figure, he was his hero. Every evening, they would build forts out of cushions or tinker with small projects in the backyard. Filling the house with laughter. "You're his world, you know," Claire said one evening as she watched them from the kitchen. Her eyes softened as she added, "You're mine too." Claire's professional life flourished as she continued to climb the corporate ladder. Her hard work and determination eventually led to her becoming the youngest CEO of her company, a milestone that garnered attention from the media and admiration from her peers. But despite her success, she remained grounded, her focus always returning to the family she had built with Daniel. Her parents, now elderly and reflective, began reaching out more frequently. After years of estrangement, they finally extended an olive branch. Inviting Claire and her family to dinner. "I don't know if I can do this," Claire admitted to Daniel as she prepared for the meeting. "They hurt me so much." Daniel placed his hands on her shoulders, his voice steady. "They're trying to make amends. But no matter what happens, you have us." Claire nodded, her resolve strengthening. "You're right. This isn't just about me anymore, it's about showing Nathan what forgiveness can look like." The dinner was tense at first, the silence heavy with unspoken regrets. But as the evening wore on, her parents began to open up, apologizing for the pain they had caused and expressing their pride in the woman Claire had become. "We were wrong," her father said, his voice thick with emotion. "And we're so sorry." Claire glanced at Daniel, who gave her an encouraging nod. She took a deep breath, her voice steady. "I forgive you," she said. "But it'll take time to rebuild what we lost." Her mother reached for her hand, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, Claire. We'll do whatever it takes." The reconciliation brought a sense of closure that allowed Claire to fully embrace her new life. Her parents became doting grandparents to Nathan, and though the wounds of the past couldn't be erased, they began to heal together. One evening, as Claire and Daniel sat on the porch watching the sunset, she turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" she asked. Daniel chuckled, his arm draped around her shoulders. "Every day," he said. "Sometimes I still can't believe it." Claire smiled, her gaze drifting to Nathan, who was chasing fireflies in the yard. "You changed everything for us, Daniel. I hope you know that." "You gave me a reason to change," Daniel replied. "Before you and Nathan, I didn't think I had a purpose. But now, I can't imagine life without you." Claire leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart full. "We're a team," she said. "And we're just getting started." As the stars began to dot the sky, Nathan ran up to them, his tiny hands cupping a firefly. "Look, Dad. Isn't it amazing?" Daniel smiled, his chest swelling with pride. "It sure is, buddy." Claire watched them, her eyes glistening with tears. In that moment, she knew that every struggle, every heartbreak, had led her to this, a life filled with love, hope, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. Together, they faced the future as a family bound not by blood, but by the choices they had made to fight for each other. And as the world continued to turn, they remained a testament to the power of resilience, love, and second chances.